money from a guy named Steve Blank, who we had managed to lose some of his money in the past. And he suggested, in his inimical way, that if we came and audited his new class that he was teaching at UC Berkeley about this thing called customer development, he'd be happy to write us a check. And we thought, well, sit in class for a free check, pretty good deal. And not the biggest entrepreneurial no-brainer of all time. And so I just want to say, I was there when Steve was talking about customer development, and there would be MBAs in the back of the room just being like, yeah, it sounds obvious, but like, who's doing this? And Steve would kind of look around and, well, and he'd try to give the answer that all of us have been trying to give for a long time with these new ideas, right? Well, they're new ideas, so it's not like it's been a subject to academic study, but these are the ideas from Steve's experience that made sense. These are the ideas that this kind of community of practice that he had this vision that would grow up one day would embrace. And so I was there when customer development was considered completely crazy. It's been passed through misunderstood. It's, I think, now starting to be considered obvious in some quarters. And the customer development story, as we talked about this morning, is really only just starting. So I couldn't be more pleased to introduce Steve Blank to tell you a little bit about why accountants don't run startups. Thank you. And thanks, Steve.
So my talk today is titled, of all things, Why Accountants Don't Run Startups. Can we go to the slides? Thanks. I drew this. That's what some of you might know me for. And as Eric said, I called it customer development. And it was simply based on 21 years, 8 startups, and now retiring and having time to actually think about this. And when I did it, I actually ended up writing this, 4 Steps to the Epiphany. Not for any of you, it was actually for me, to try to make sense out of those 21 years, 8 startups. Why did it work sometimes and not others? And by this time, I had been sitting on advisory boards and boards of directors and was realizing that I was seeing the same pattern repeat over and over again. And that entrepreneurs would actually fail the same way over and over again. And I really thought that there was some deep pattern that was hidden in that data. So not only did I write this, surprising everybody, including me, a few people read it in some bizarre places. I don't want to show you the medical emergency slide that followed this one, but after I retired and wrote this, I've been teaching for the last 10 years entrepreneurship in both Stanford, Berkeley, and a class a year in Columbia. And the last 10 years of what I've been doing is mostly found here on my blog on www.steveblank.com. Some of it are war stories from my life, how I got to where I am. Some of it where I think I'm going. But some of it a lot of reflections on entrepreneurship and where it fits in the economy, in our lives, and how we could do better at it. So one of the things I'm going to do is tell you a couple of stories. But first, the relationship that Eric and I have is kind of the same relationship now that all of you have to Eric. And the thing that someone mentioned to me is when the student is ready, the master appears. And I said, well, that's nice, but I think you got it backwards. Because I really think when the master is ready, the students appear. And so thank you very much for all being here. But you put both Eric and I into a place where we had to perform. And we had to deliver. And so what I'd like to tell you today are 5 short stories about what's going on in entrepreneurship and where we all kind of fit in the universe. Some of it will touch on customer development, but more of it will touch on why do we do what we're doing and why at times doesn't it quite make sense. And so we're going to back up a bit and give you a bigger picture. So there are a couple of tectonic shifts happening in entrepreneurship, which you all know about, both here in this audience and across the world watching on video streams. But I just want to remind you of what you're participating in. The Silicon Valley funding pyramid has shifted dramatically in the last 5 years. The traditional VCs, the Sequoias, the benchmarks, et cetera, are now $250 million to multi-billion-dollar funds. They're actually acting like hedge funds or investment banks. I mean, they could fund huge deals, but they don't write $50,000, $100,000, $500,000 checks. There's now a set of smaller VC funds, First Round Capital, Union Square, kind of sit on top of them, but also super angels, seed funds like Floodgate, Ron Conway and SV Angel, Softtech, et cetera. And angels and incubators, Y Combinator, Techstars. These are not only happening in Silicon Valley, they're happening worldwide. And the most interesting thing is the innovation is happening on the top of the pyramid. What are the three innovations? I think the new trends, as my friend Mike Maples loved to say, is 500 grand is the new 5 million, driven by the top of the pyramid. Customer development and lean startups, commodity software have all, as you know, because you're doing it every day, dramatically slashed the cost of starting a company. Seed funds are now providing the source of entrepreneurial education. Should be an embarrassment to every major research university in the world, and trust me, it is. There are close to 100 accelerators worldwide in some form teaching entrepreneurs how to build and start companies. And customer development and lean startups, which you've all kind of proven, is beginning to be adopted more than just in the classroom by a series of practitioners like yourselves who are actually learning, testing, adopting, and teaching us back. This is probably the first methodology that's been crowdsourced. Big idea. Unlike previous methodologies where there was an author, a textbook, and take it or leave it, this is an iterative process, and I think we're all collectively getting smarter at a very scary rate. A couple of things I want to point out that I see when I see startups both in Silicon Valley, New York, and then compare them to startups in other places in the United States and other places in other countries. It's that not all startups are equal. Here in Silicon Valley, we use the word startup and entrepreneur in a way that's really not accurate. Let me explain. Elsewhere, worldwide, an entrepreneur is someone who starts up a small company whose goal is a small business. Their goal at the end of their startup process is they've found their business model of a profitable business that could generate an annual revenue that makes themselves and their families comfortable. They build it around an existing team, and if they ever see anything close to millions of dollars a year in revenue, that's nirvana. By the way, that's not the exception in the United States. That's the rule. There are 5.7 million small businesses in the U.S. under 500 employees. They make up 99.7% of all companies in the U.S. Big idea. They employ about half of all workers in the U.S. These people do startups. They are entrepreneurs. In Silicon Valley, we use a pejorative and say, oh, they're lifestyle businesses. They're not. They are entrepreneurs. But the interesting fact is that the internet has also allowed a new class of small businesses to emerge, and this is what confuses a lot of these entrepreneurs. I'm on the net. See, I'm just like all the companies Sequoia and Kleiner Perkins fund. No, you're not. The internet also allows a new class of small businesses. The real confusion is the distinction between a startup that wants to be a small business and a startup that wants to be a scalable startup. A scalable startup has a much different goal from day one. Those of you in the audience, both here and worldwide, who are starting something, who say, we are going to take over the universe, are a scalable startup. You're also crazy, but you're a scalable startup. You're looking at total available markets of $500 million and above. You're typically looking at a company that could grow $100 million a year in revenue. Your exit out of a scalable startup is you're looking for a business model, and you focus on execution and process when you find that business model. A couple interesting things about a scalable startup. They're designed to grow big, and they typically, though not always, but typically need risk capital. Anybody know what risk capital means? Venture. By the way, anybody know what venture capital used to be called in the 1950s when they first invented the term? It was originally called adventure capital. I kind of like that word better because it's actually truer to the source of what we do with their money. Let's have an adventure. And that's why they call it risk capital to their, limited partners. But the key idea here is when Silicon Valley and high-tech centers talk about startups, there's an implicit word in front of that like you haven't gotten the memo about. It's a scalable startup. And that's why the confusion of, do we need venture money or not, or blah, blah, blah. It's about what class of company are you building. They have very different startup goals. One is not better than another. I will refuse to take the pejorative and say the top one's a lifestyle business. Actually, I think the top one is run by normal people. We're the ones who are certifiable, who actually, jump out. Anybody here skydive or bungee jump? Okay. Too bad we can't put a camera on that, because that's an abnormal population. This is a population that tends towards risk. You do a scalable startup, you want risk in your life. I just want you to remember, though, when we talk about venture-funded companies, we're talking about the things on the bottom. Not that it's a value judgment, it's just that's the way it is. That's how VCs make money, are funding scalable startups. Now, if life was just simple, by the way, you go from the startup stuff we're all doing, we run the lean process, and then we turn into a large company, life for entrepreneurs personally would at least have a happy ending. But here's something that VCs don't tell you. There's a box in the middle. It's called the transition, which is my polite term. I'll explain what it really happens there. But if you think about what goes on in a startup, your job as an entrepreneur in a startup is to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. Period. End of discussion. When you find it, your job is to build a company around that business model. And to become a large company, you then put processes in place to execute that business model. That's the entire life cycle. Search, build, and grow. The memo you don't get from VCs says founders depart. We bring in professional management, we layer in process, and it's the beginning of scale. Now, every entrepreneur I know, who I show this diagram to, including me, went, oh, thanks, yeah, I kind of knew that, and of course, I'm going to be just like Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison and Bill Gates, as I'll be the guy on the right. Not all of you are laughing, because all of you should. Okay? We get confused with the exceptions on blogs and newspapers. 99% of the founders don't see the promised land. Why? And the why is going to be about this talk. Why doesn't that happen? And also, why accountants don't run startups. The corollary is why founders don't run large companies. Let me remind you, startup is the organization used to search for a scalable and repeatable business model. Now, what's interesting is your job as entrepreneurs is to leave the box on the left. Oh, think about it. Your job is not to stay on the left. Your job is to go to the right. Let me remind you what you're doing inside that box on the left. Let's talk about the difference for a second between business plans and business models. I've been talking about business model, but most of you might be more familiar with a business plan. Anybody ever write a business plan? Those of you watching virtually, raise your hands too, and we have the telepathic channel here, and I'll be able to see you. Let me remind you what a business plan is good for. Okay, let's move on. Okay. And here's why. No business plan survives first contact with customers. Period. Business plan is a static document. It's great for organizing your thoughts. It's great for having you put together the financials, just so you can understand what creative writing is about. But if I'm actually trying to manage my startup and pivot, you can't pivot around the plan. It's sitting there. It's inert. I tend to teach now that we need to search for a business model. And the difference is a business plan is static. A business model is a diagram that you can update constantly that shows how a company creates, delivers, and captures value. A business model is dynamic. And in English, a business model is how a company makes money. And the emphasis on a business model is to show you all the components of your business that you're testing outside the building. And it's showing you where you continuously pivot. Did we have to change our sales channel? Did we have to change features? Did we have to change demand creation? Oh, look, the amount of money we thought we'd get from our customers are really pretty different than we thought, because it's zero. That was pretty different. A business model diagram allows you to constantly sketch this. And I'm not going to bore you to death here with the details, because there's some great stuff online. Someone named Alexander Osterwalder does business model generation. You should take a look at his website. On my blog, I've put up some things about how I teach this. But this is a way for you to keep score. Now, the interesting thing, as I said, is startups on the left search and pivot. Companies execute. In your startup, you're searching for a business model. This is why you are entrepreneurs. No one else can do this. Large companies get to cash flow break even, they're profitable, they're heading towards rapid scale, you're bringing new senior management. There's a magic number, by the way, of 150 at 150 people. Like it or not, you're a company, just because of the way human beings and organizations work. Something that's interesting is comparing the differences between what large companies do and what startups do. One of the things that used to frustrate me in teaching is, and as an entrepreneur, let's just take it as an entrepreneur. Anybody ever been in a board meeting in the beginning with investors? Anybody here ever? Anybody ever have to put together a balance sheet, cash flow, income statement? Yeah, raise your hand, right? How to become accountants. And I remember in multiple startups doing all that, and every month saying, income statement, 0. Income statement, 0. Income statement, 0. And it never dawned on me that, so I got board members to go, ask me, what value is going on here? Now, we can understand the value of balance sheets, income statements, and cash flow in large companies. There's a lot of stuff going on because you've got a lot of numbers to worry about. In a startup, I will contend the only number on the right you need to worry about is cash. How much do I got left, and when am I going to hit the ground? But the other numbers you really need to worry about are these. They're metrics about your business. They're not about accounting. So I'll give you a good example. In a board meeting, if all your board is asking you about is cash flow, balance sheet, and income statement, you got the wrong board. Because they better be asking you about metrics about your search for your business model. What are those appropriate metrics? I don't know. It's about your business, not mine. But they are not, 0, 0, 0. There's no value added there. Does that make sense? Difference between metrics and accounting? You better be reporting to some adult, here's our metrics. If they're not, then it's just like brownie in motion. Another difference. Customer validation versus sales. Anybody know what a senior VP of corporate large company sales look like? Anybody ever see one? I mean, like they fill up all available space in a room, right? And they got the lowest handicap of anybody you've ever met, right? I mean, in fact, they're probably like have another career as a professional golfer. Right? And I always used to think, wouldn't that be great? I could hire like the world's best VP of sales from IBM. Do you think the world's best VP of sales of IBM actually knows how to sell anymore? Do you think they know how to get thrown out of 43 accounts? Do you think they know what to do in a startup when you're selling to early adopters and engineering is changing the feature set about every hour and a half? And in fact, you make up the data sheets just before you walk into the customer? I would do that all the time. These are not the same people. And what screws up startup is thinking that they are. You're doing very different things. Same thing as customer development versus product management. In a large company, there's a group that writes marketing requirements, documents, figures out feature specs and competitive analysis. Anybody ever do that? Oh man, I used to be great at that. Turns out it has nothing to do with a startup. In a startup, it's all about hypothesis testing. What's the minimum feature set? How do we pivot? It's the antithesis. In fact, if you hire a traditional product manager, smoke will come out of their ears within the first 30 days. And in fact, I see some of you smoke coming out of your ears going, oh, that explains why we're confused. These are not usually the same people. And if they are, you need to brainwash them and deprogram them. Because all the skills used to execute a business model are very different from the skills needed in a lean startup running customer development and agile development to search for a business model. Making sense, you know? And of course, engineering versus agile. Very simple. Do you have a tech pubs department? I know you're a large company. Oh, somebody's getting rid of their tech pubs people right now. So we want to do twittering, fire tech pubs. But truly, think about it. Hey, I got the documentation perfectly right. Oh, that product was obsolete yesterday. We pivoted. Engineering departments have requirements docs, waterfall development, QA, tech pubs. There's nothing wrong with these. Don't get me wrong. If you're in a large company, you can't have chaos. You need organization. But if you bring that same execution mentality to engineering, instead of that, you should be doing this. Everything we've been talking about, continuous deployment, continuous learning, self-organizing teams, minimum feature sets, pivots. Now tell me the same VP of engineering who was so proud of their QA and tech pubs department comes in and does this? I don't think so. That's why you get these culture clashes. Because you don't quite understand, which side of the chart are you on? So remember, I've been talking about the search for a business model. So finally, the context for today and the whole session is, in that scalable startup box on the left is everything we've been talking about today. Lean startups execute customer and agile development. And the sum of the two is how you search for that business model. That's all you're doing here. Is you're using processes to find profits. And here's a scary idea. How many of you love the endorphin rush of being an entrepreneur? Come on, admit it. Yeah, right. I did it 8 times. The problem is that you fail if you stay in the box to the left, at least in one company. The goal is not to be a startup. The goal is to be a large company. And that is a little depressing to people who love the search. Because the search is bringing order out of chaos. It's taking risks. It's pivoting all the time. We're great at that. In fact, my background comes from a dysfunctional family where I had to bring order out of chaos every 20 minutes. And it turns out a higher percentage of founders come from dysfunctional families, but that's another class. But I just want you to remember that the goal is not to be the world's most fun startup. The goal is to be the entrepreneur with the world's largest liquidity event on the right. Now, here's the point of this presentation. why startups aren't run by accountants. And this gets a little more into leadership and management. Let's think about what we need to be a leader of a startup. And I won't do the eye test on the chart. I'll read them to you. My kind of list of what startup and founding CEOs need to bring to the table are as follows. The question is, what kind of personal contribution is the CEO making? How much time are they putting in? How do they do planning? What kind of process is it? What management style? What span of control, focus, and how do they deal with uncertainty and chaos? And in a startup, the CEO's personal contribution, look around. If you don't think you're the best at something in this startup, you ought not be the founder. You ought to be a superstar in something. No bureaucrats here. And you better be, and not only should you be convinced, it's very helpful if your co-founders actually think you're pretty good at something too. Your time commitment, I put 24/7, but it's actually not true. It's about 49/12. Right? I mean, you're like multitasking in multiple dimensions at the same time. And planning, we don't need no planning. We're opportunistic and agile. We know how to pivot. And process, we hate and eliminate process, as somebody pointed out on my blog. Well, what about lean startup? Except for that process. We like that process. That's the non-process. Management style. On a good day, and one of my ex-VPs of marketing here, Doug, raise your hand, Doug Campbell. Doug, would you say my management style on a good day was a benign dictatorship? Sometimes leaving off the benign part. Entrepreneurs typically are not running the most democratic companies in the world. It's, hey, we're moving. We'll listen to you on a good day, but we're moving. Span of control, hands-on. Focus, high and passionate vision, and brings order out of chaos. 3 wheels fell off, 12 customers told us no, but fine. You know what happens? We're going to move on. But in the transition, you need somebody who could lead a larger organization, whose time commitment is as needed rather than 24/7. When you're searching for a business model, it's pretty cool to say, look, I never sleep. Anybody ever been burned out? Anybody? Yeah. You can't do that forever. Can't do it forever. And when you crash, it's not good for you, but heck with you if I'm your investor, it's not good for your company. I want somebody who could actually manage their time now because we found a business model. And I want you to be mission and goal driven, and we might need some process driven by the mission. And management style, we're a bigger company now. Sodas are no longer free. And we need to distribute some authority down to departments because we now might have departments with managers, if not VPs. And we're a mission-driven company, and we focus on fast response. So where the scalable startup was about search, the management style here is build. And by the time you become a large company, you're now managing plans, goals, processes, and personnel. And long-term, 9 to 5 and whatever hours you get on the golf course. You're process and goal-driven. You implement and use processes, and the organization is more than likely bureaucratic for command and control. The span of control is distributed down to the organization, and the focus is on execution, execution, execution. We have found the business model to make money. Let me give you my favorite example here. CEO on the left can create something out of nothing. Incredibly creative. Imagine you stuck that CEO on the left and snuck him in and gave him a Walmart store for a day. CEO on the left would go, wait a minute, these shelves, they're not put together efficiently. Let's reshelve everything. The store opens the next morning. What happens? Chaos. Walmart, McDonald's, large corporations, as a generic rule, don't want 100,000 creative employees. They really don't. They couldn't find 100,000 creative employees. But, for those who get mad at people at Walmart and other companies, you're confused what they're doing. Those employees are not hired to be you. They're not searching for anything. They're executing a formula that's already been proven way in the dim past by people like you to be profitable. Does this make sense? So these people who are managing large companies, their job is to grow. Now let me tell you why I always find this interesting at the intersection of entrepreneurship, education, and your jobs. Because this is somewhat of a Shakespearean tragedy. Because every one of you, hopefully, will search for a model and find it. And almost none of you in this room will get to be that executive on the right. Whoa. Let me tell you who the model is for every one of you. Back in the early 1920s, the modern U.S. corporation was built by this guy. His name was Alfred P. Sloan. Anybody know who Alfred P. Sloan was? Anybody know anything named after him? Yeah, MIT, business school, Sloan Kettering Institute and Cancer Institute in New York. Anybody know who Kettering was? This VP of engineering. Why, of course. Right? Alfred P. Sloan was the president and chairman of General Motors. He basically brought cost accounting to the modern American corporation that allowed divisionalization to happen. He was the one that created the ability of modern American corporations to divisionalize and between the world wars grow big in the U.S. and post-war made it the American century by allowing the first wave of internationalization of American companies to happen. His management style. This guy ran GM for almost 35 years. Now, the interesting thing about Alfred P. Sloan is when you talk about the history of General Motors, this is who you talk about. Unfortunately, you don't talk about the founder. This guy, Billy Durant. Billy Durant founded General Motors. I'd be stunned if anybody in this room actually knew his name. Billy Durant was one of the few entrepreneurs in the early 1900s that was the leader in horse-drawn buggies and was smart enough to make the transition. He built General Motors out of these separate brands, and because he was the crazy entrepreneur, was fired by the board. And he said, oh yeah? Well, I'm going to start another car company called Chevrolet. He used Chevrolet to buy up all of GM stock and threw the board out. He regained control of General Motors until the board, ran by the DuPonts, fired him. GM, when they fired the founder, was the equivalent, in today's dollars, of $3.6 billion in sales. And none of us have ever heard of Billy Durant. Durant versus Sloan. What happened? Well, Sloan dies rich, honored, and famous. Durant dies penniless managing a bowling alley. He was an accountant. You are here. Don't be confused. That's why accountants don't run startups, but usually make the money unless you've negotiated your founder's exit agreement up front. So my last story is E school versus B school. U.S. business schools, and there is a connection here, U.S. business schools in the 20th century turned out Sloan managers. Think about it. Alfred P. Sloan and General Motors typified what the modern American corporation needed for business leaders and business managers. And business schools in the United States rose to the occasion like nowhere else in the world. They taught execution, they taught strategy, they taught accounting, they taught products, they taught engineering and marketing and management and administrative functions. We were turning out the leaders of the U.S. century. But no one was teaching entrepreneurship school. That is, the skills we need here and for those of you watching us, are radically different. We don't need to know how to manage $3 billion divisions. We're trying to figure out how to keep the lights on and find our first customers. We're in the search business. We need to be taught how do we do hypothesis testing and testing business models and customer development and agile development and metrics and pivots and venture finance and do this all hands-on. Where's that school? Interesting. The courses you get in business school are managerial finance, accounting, managing groups and teams, financial accounting, operations, modeling for optimization. I won't tell you which business school I took this from, but you could guess. It starts with an S, and it's somewhere around here. Now, I won't say that these are all useless for entrepreneurs. You might, but I won't. The classes, the actual courses, I'll contend that we ought to be teaching this new wave of entrepreneurs that have risen in spite of what we've been teaching in business school look like this. We need to be teaching entrepreneurial management, creativity and innovation, technology entrepreneurship, patent law for entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial finance, hands-on classes that get you outside of the building. We need E-school, not B-school. My belief is that E-school will emerge, that entrepreneurial education is going to change rapidly. E-school students are not B-school students. And I'm not saying that there's nothing useful in business school, but you can't convince me that the same courses that you'll use to train a manager of a Sloan class corporation is the same one that will teach you the street smarts on how to get your first set of customers when you have nothing but 2 engineers and you're running out of money and you're living in your parents' garage. Not the same. Y Combinator and Techstars and the like are the first inkling of how important this education process is. There's over 100 startup accelerator programs already in place worldwide. So my closing remarks are, let's help build this together. Startup accelerators have great coaching, great networking, but minimal methodology. Lean startups and customer development have great methodology, but no educational institution. There seems to be an opportunity here for all of us, Eric, me, Sean Ellis, everybody else who was speaking today, to start helping the accelerators actually have something more than let's go meet a couple of founders and have dinner once a week. I think we could really be teaching this until the universities catch up, and they will. Universities just have a longer time period than we do. In 5 years, you will see these in engineering schools and the leading research universities. I guarantee it. Stanford, Harvard, and others get it, but it just takes time. So in the meantime, why don't we just keep in mind that the E-school we all want is the Durant School of Entrepreneurship. And so with that, let me just remind you what the Durant School School of Entrepreneurship would look like. Every entrepreneurship school needs T-shirts and coffee cups and buttons. And Doug, do we have some? So I think the T-shirts and coffee cups ought to look something like, why, yes, I'm an entrepreneur. And they ought to have their own clothing store. So if you're interested, the Durant School of Entrepreneurship is open for business on Cafe Press. And so why don't we give some of these out? And thank you very much. Okay. You done? Yeah. You want to take a few questions? Yeah. You want me to? Go ahead. All right. All right, I'll take, Eric says I have some time for some questions. Any questions about the incoherent, yes?
How do we avoid dying penniless running bowling alley?
So if you really read the history about Durant, he was certifiable, right? This was only half facetious. The problem is that we're not taught by venture capitalists that there is that transition stage. Why? Because the first one that's honest, you'll go to the next one who'll lie to you. And I'm not dissing VCs. Why would you go to somebody who said, listen, the odds are we're probably going to fire you after you succeed? But by the way, that's exactly what happens. We as entrepreneurs need to be more self-aware of A, who we are, and B, how the process works, and C, how long our interests are aligned to the VCs. Our interests are not aligned all the way. Our interests are aligned with our investors right now while you're searching for the business model. Right now, searching for the model, your company is worthless. When you find the business model, all of a sudden that VC that's sitting on 9 other boards is paying a lot more attention to you because there's a lot more at risk. And what you did spectacularly well, search for a model by being chaotic and crazy and flying around the country and whatever, is actually the antithesis of what they want next to achieve liquidity. So you need to be cognizant of A, do I really believe I'm that person? Or, gee, do I now need to review my founder's agreement with my VCs that said, hey, okay, I'm going to be chairman, we're going to jointly hire that person, we're not going to bring in the suit too early, and this is why entrepreneurship is an art, not done by spreadsheet, right? It truly is an art. Does that answer your question? Or? Okay. One more question. Yes?
You and many other people talk brilliantly about the search for the machine, the perfect machine, or the perfect, model. And there's a lot of material out there, but I'm wondering, what about for those of us who feel like they've begun to find the model and they're just about to cross the chasm, and they're true entrepreneurs, those early guys, the guys who will end up penniless, but they're trying to figure out how to kind of start to run companies. Tools like dealing with your staff, dealing with actually taking some money. This is an area where there's no education out there.
Right, and that's why I'm dead serious about changing the nature. My personal next goal is to change the nature of entrepreneurial education in the United States for both small business and scalable startups. And those things you raise are exactly the curriculum I want to put in place for both universities and for entrepreneurial accelerators. I mean, that's what I do now. I retired 10 years ago, and I love teaching. I love trying to have all of you avoid, like I could have done this if I would have known half this stuff in 3 startups rather than 8. And I'd rather pass that on to you. So those are the things I'd like to hear from you guys. What's the course list? What are the things you guys want to hear? What do you need to be taught? What are you not getting from anywhere else? The other piece of data, if I could riff on that for 10 seconds, is the difference now being an entrepreneur from when I started is, when I started there was no data. You had no one to talk to. There was no internet. There was no 500 blogs. Now the problem is you could get a piece of advice that tells you anything you want to hear. No, seriously, if you go look at the world of blogs. So the problem I believe today is not a lack of information, but a lack of a framework to tell you how to take that information into something that's actionable for you. You could, if you want to, find something on how to set up your company, here's advice A and here's advice B, and that's great, but they're mutually exclusive. Does that make sense? So you could help back. I'm taking email, sblankksranch.com. If anybody's interested in helping put together this curriculum over time, we will get this done. So thank you very much, and my apologies for going over.
Thank you. I already unplugged you. You're all right there. Let me take this.